Morning. I have to say it's a real pleasure and honour to be here today, and my great thanks to Cynthia for making this happen, and obviously for the BJA for sponsoring me to come here as well. But I'm really pleased that I can share my experiences with you as a practitioner, I have to say. I suppose I call myself an academic now because I've got a master's degree from Cambridge, which is where I met Cynthia, and Cynthia taught me through everything to do with my patrol strategies. And when it came up as an idea, Cynthia had a vision for how it would look, and I'm so pleased with the end result, and I wouldn't have got there without Cynthia's help. But really, all I am is just a cop for 27 years in Derbyshire Police in one force. I've done quite a few jobs in that time, as it says in my in the pack there. But as I'm talking to you here today as a complete and utter practitioner. When you see my patrol strategies, you'll see some of them will link with some of the questions that have been asked already about what we call persistent priority offenders, people that have just been released from prison, and a whole range of activities. And the discussions we had about the patrol strategies that I was using and the force was using as a whole were actually quite interesting because, especially when we get into how actually Derbyshire's portfolio looks, and that was the big finding for us here. So anyway, I'll get straight into it. But I have to say, Cynthia, the presentation that you saw there in terms of that, I've seen that before, which is great, and that was my starting point. But I have to say that the tool, I went into the evidence-based policing matrix loads and loads and loads of times because that was really important to my studies to quantify the strengths and weaknesses of them. Just a little context for the moment. This is a map of England, and it's been on the news quite a lot recently. I don't need to talk about the reasons why, but there you see Derbyshire right in the middle. And just a few facts about where I'm from. It's one of 43 police forces in England and Wales. It's bordered by 7 forces. We're quite away from the coast, as you can see there. It's quite a big area, but a lot of it's rural as well. We've got 1,000 square miles and 1.1 million population, and it's split into 3 policing divisions. We have about 66,000 crimes a year, and that's been reducing year on year for the past 8 years. So obviously a figure that Derbyshire is very proud of, as is crime generally reducing in England. And it's a fairly safe place to live because we only have about 12 murders on average a year. So I just want to give you that context for the places that you work, and I'm sure you have a lot more murders in some areas of England than we do, and likewise in some parts of England than Derbyshire. As a workforce, we've got about 2,000 police officers, and that will be reducing because of the cuts to policing budgets. And we've got about 1,400 police staff. As I said, the 3 divisions, one of the divisions is very rural, and a lot of tourists come there. It's very picturesque, very beautiful place to come, steeped in tradition and history. But our Derby City has the biggest proportion of crime in that area, about 40% of the crime for the whole of the force. It has about a 7.9% black and minority ethnic population, and that's predominantly based in the city. So that's just to give you some context of where I'm from. Okay, why assess the evidence-based strategies in your own organisation? Well, ironically, and Cynthia's mentioned Professor Larry Sherman already. He was the course director at Cambridge University, and he said in 1984, the year that I joined, most police practice is still shaped by local opinions, customs and theories, and Cynthia's alluded to that already. And I have to say, when I started in Derbyshire, Derbyshire is no different to most other forces in the UK. It has a general mixture of reactive strategies which target individuals, groups, and also some enforcement operations and crime prevention type operations. I think the key here, as Cynthia's already alluded to, is using strategies and tactics actually based on scientific evidence. It seems a logical way forward, and that was one of the reasons, another reason why I wanted to take on this work. And it was that opportunity to examine all that empirical evidence that you've seen that is in that matrix to assist you in actually achieving what your goal is. And I wanted to use that data to really analyse Derbyshire's strategies, so I can inform our senior leaders about those strategies which has the most indicative effects at controlling crime, and therefore assisting daily activities. So when officers go on patrol, they know whether to turn right or left out of the police station, and they have a purpose. And that's something which our Deputy Chief Constable quite readily asks officers, you know, how do you make your decision, whether to turn right or left out of the police station? It could be a dead end one way, you know, that's an important point. But I wanted to create this systematic feedback loop, which Cynthia talked about earlier, and all the evidence base that's there as well. So I wanted to use that data to look at the effectiveness of the patrol functions in Derbyshire in the pre and post planning stages, and that's where the matrix is very, very helpful. I've got an operational superintendent, a commander in one of the divisions that I work at in my force, who I've introduced recently to the evidence-based policing matrix. He's planning what you call an LPR operation. We call it automatic number plate retrieval, ANPR operation, same technology in his area. And I've introduced him to the matrix, and he's really up for it. We've discussed the matrix. He's looking at the evidence that's in there in order to assist him in the pre-planning of his operation. When he uses the intervention technique that he's going to do, whether that's patrol functions or use of but use of targeted intervention using LPR, then he's going to look at that intervention and see if it worked, and that's the post-planning stage. Okay. In Derbyshire, the Home Office of, like all other forces, the Home Office have set the police sort of twin challenges: reducing our budgets by 20%, but also with a continued expectation that the police service will still provide a high level of service. In Derbyshire, that means that we're going to lose about another 150 cops from that 2,000 figure. So with resources diminishing and the UK as a whole losing about 30,000 officers and staff, that's about 16,000 cops. That's predicted by the end of 2015, and you've probably seen that on the news. The important point I want to get across here is that cost saving is an opportunity to introduce evidence. And part of my research allowed me to look at an activity-based costings exercise. It was slightly historic data, and every police force in the UK had to do this. We've stopped doing it now for reasons of bureaucracy, which is helpful, but the data that was published, and you'll see more about it in a few slides, I was able to analyse how much time officers actually had on visible patrol, which was very helpful when you're looking about cost effectiveness and actually targeting your resources to the most productive places, using the most productive strategies. Okay, here you've got a list, similar to the list that Cynthia's put up. You'll be able to sort of have a quick snapshot of the types of targets and be familiar with your own agency's portfolio. This is a list of functions, patrol functions, that I mapped into the matrix. I tried to get across a whole cross-section of activity from the whole of the force, excuse me. Some of the tactics are very victim-based, some are more offender-based, and some are location-based. But the ones in blue, I just highlighted that for purposes of yourselves, just to pick up a couple. You know, door knocks, community engagement, that features very heavily in certain areas of policing that we do. We have safer neighbourhood teams that patrol a number of areas. The targeting underage sales, that's just about people that are selling to underage kids. But number 8 and number 7, I just highlight that because number 8 is what we call our Operation Vanquish. I actually implemented that to target a specific burglary problem that was happening with cross-border criminals. And it was part of an LPR operation. And then number 7 there was a high-vis patrol with partner agencies. We had, about 2 or 3 years ago, just about 2 years ago, we had our first shooting of a black teenager in Derby, and the response was very, very proactive, as you would expect from the police's perspective, because we wanted to get into the reasons why people were getting into, why gangs were using, had moved to the extreme of using lethal force. So we did a lot of activity around that, and that particular patrol function was reviewed by an external force, a neighbouring force of Leicestershire. It came very, very strong in terms of what we would class as a very, very highly proactive tactic, and it'd be interesting to see where I saw that, and in discussions with Cynthia, where that fell into the matrix. You'll be able to relate a lot of your own strategies to the types of things that I did. The most important point I wanted to get here was taking time out to find out what you're doing was really enlightening for me, because you need to ask yourselves, what is it you're trying to achieve here? In all of mine was about trying to impact on crime reduction. Okay, some of the tactics that we used actually weren't around crime reduction. They may have been to increase confidence or police legitimacy. But the other key point here was all of these had to be coded to see where they would fall into the matrix once you actually populate that three-dimensional box, which we're coming to. Okay. Cynthia talked about the coding, and this is a key part, very, very valuable in discussions with your colleagues about how you actually see your own tactics. I use the matrix in the same way that Cynthia's described it. The only difference I did was I took a slightly more nuanced approach and decided to add a numerical value to the Z, Y and Z axis. Okay, as you can see there, 1, 2 and 3. And I have definitions about what general focused and highly focused is, and we came up with the same rationale that Cynthia had as well, and she's talked about already. But the reason why I did that, adding that numerical value, was that I felt it was helping me in particular slightly more accurately map the tactics. And you'll see what I mean by that in a little while. The links to the similar studies in the similar studies matrix here, this particular one. Cynthia's mentioned it already. Gloria Laycock in 1991 did a study that's in the when you click on that, you get what that study was. The reason why, wherever there was a similar study linked to what we were doing for that door knocks, for example, and that was just officers going around knocking on people's doors in a particular neighbourhood, trying to offer crime prevention advice, trying to target hard where necessary, garner community intelligence, look at the reasons, look at where there was antisocial behaviour, those sorts of things. And it was quite proactive and focused strategy in a particular neighbourhood. The reason behind it was we wanted to try and reduce crime. Well, Gloria Laycock did a study in 1991 around similar types of issues. So where there was a similar study in the matrix, it gave us more confidence to say, well, actually, what we're doing is it's not bad, and you can actually use that information very, very easily as well. That's the key point here. And then the hypothesis about effectiveness, I just gave a coding there with Cynthia about what doesn't work. 2 and 3 are promising or likely to be effective, and then could we make a decision on Derbyshire's tactics to see actually, well, we can't make a decision because that might be there was no study linked to it, or we just really couldn't make a decision on it. Doesn't mean to say it was bad, okay, but that's the way that it goes. But the coding is so useful because what it allows you to do, it allows you to really analyse what patrol functions you're actually doing and really take them apart and get into the weeds. That was really important because unless you're thinking about what your mechanism of prevention is, and if it is crime reduction or some other tactic like police legitimacy or reducing fear, then we're always going to be in that zone of we always do things this way because it's custom, opinion, that sort of thing. It's really valuable to understand what you're doing and why. Okay, that's the good thing about this coding. Really important part of the of my thesis. Yes, sir.
Effectiveness scale, right? So, because all those other things are going on at the same time.
Yes, that's a good point, and I'm going to answer it in the next slide if that's okay. I'll answer it now. Decision making about effectiveness. Once the tactic's mapped, where does it fall in the matrix? Okay, that was the first bit. Does it fall within an area deemed to be promising, such as an effective realm, like Cynthia alluded to? That's the first point. The second tactic, the second issue about hypothesised effectiveness, whether we gave it a 2 or a 3, was were there any similar studies in the matrix which have been shown to be particularly effective for that particular patrol function? So, for example, the previous slide talked about Gloria Laycock and the door knocks. Gloria Laycock did a methodologically rigorous study in 1991 which had a lot of strong resemblance to the type of study that we were doing called door knocks. And by that, allowed us to make that hypothesis about effectiveness. And you'll see where that particular study fell. Well, you've seen about you see the matrix, okay? And this is Derbyshire's 22 studies mapped into the matrix. And a promising realm is where for effectiveness is where focus, place-based and highly proactive dimensions intersect, as Cynthia's already alluded to. So in my study, I took, when we mapped them into the matrix, this is where they fell. Now, okay, you get some idea of the types of strategies that we were looking at and actually looking at the portfolio in a whole, in the round. So straight away you see that number 3 and number 7, I'm not going to go through all these, but just to give you an indication, that is a highly focused, highly tailored strategy. If you remember, Cynthia's went from general to focused. I just added that extra dimension in to give it the 1, 2 and the 3. And then the same studies, I just added the 1, 2 and 3 to the right hand side for my purpose of my study. So overall, 2 studies were in that top echelon of highly proactive, highly tailored studies. So the indicative effects of that, you would say, that's got a good chance of working. And I'm pleased to say that that multi-agency gang strategy in there, number 7, was a good example of that, because what we were trying to do with that one, we were trying to target the young offender, the young gang members, to stop them getting into criminality and stop them getting into gang culture before they then took hold, before the gangs took hold of them. So that was very, very intrusive. So the mechanism of prevention, particularly for that one, was very early on. So that's why it was a highly proactive, highly tailored strategy, using partner agencies to get into the kids early and to try and take them away from that. And that's an ongoing operation now still, 2 years later. We've got a full team at it, so that's why it's in there. Just a couple of other ones. In my study, because I altered the matrix slightly to have this different this numbering system, what I did was it really helped to cover tactics from each of the domains that were focused and proactive as well, because they may also be effective, and I use that, they may also be effective. So if you look at across the middle tier, you'll see a couple of slides now, that those ones there, that's the middle tier of the matrix, which does look around the focus strategies and the proactive, okay, which is around coming from here. So these two in particular. And then another element of the matrix for the middle tier may be, so those tactics 1, 11 and 6, they may be, they are proactive and they are focused as well, okay? And the indications for those tactics were that they may be promising. So by the fact that we're looking at those in more detail, we're getting a better understanding now what Derbyshire's patrol portfolio looks like. And the other thing that's immediately apparent from my exercise was that obviously immediately apparent, it typically supports the research. Across the bottom there, general to reactive, there's a number of studies across there as you can see, which does support what the evidence says about policing in general in the slides that Cynthia's already put up. Okay. When I looked at the 22 patrol strategies, it was important to look at the characteristics of them and see exactly how they were mapped across the different axes. What's immediately obvious from this, and I'm going to help you with this, is that exactly what Cynthia said just a few minutes ago. Most patrol strategies in most police forces, okay, are focused on individuals, are general, and they're mostly reactive, okay? And in Derbyshire, that really focused our attention to say, well, actually, okay, most of ours are. Okay, it's not the biggest study in the world, okay, just 22 strategies, and I could have picked more, I could have picked less, but I need to get a number that was suitable enough to actually make it meaningful. So obviously, you can see there that 10 of the studies, as I've just alluded to, mostly reactive and general in patrol. However, and that's not aligned, so that is, we're not working aligned with the evidence about what works, are we, as it stands there. But there are some other positives in it. If you look at the neighbourhood interventions, down at the bottom there, we've got 7. And, just excuse me, neighbourhood interventions account for a third of our patrol strategies, which is good. On the y-axis, on the top right there, you've got an even split between general and focus. So we have a number of, we have 10 studies there that were 10 patrol strategies that were focused. Now, even though the overall results showed that 60% of our patrol functions were either assessed as did not work or not possible to make an assessment, 9 of them were assessed as promising or likely to be effective, which was really helpful. And what I did, and what Cynthia's done in the past, you can add the individual and groups together and become person-based, okay? And out of those person-based strategies, if you combine the two, we had 12 of them, and 4 of them were classed as promising or likely to be or were similar to successfully evaluated interventions. When you combine the microplace ones and the neighbourhoods, we had 8 studies in there, and I think the key point I wanted to get here was because they were place-based studies, 5 of them were similar to successfully evaluated interventions, and 3 of them obviously weren't. But I think the key point there was that that's positive for us because our strategy across Derbyshire is around safer neighbourhood team policing. And if we've got place-based strategies that are deemed to be likely to be successful, then obviously that's something that we should be continuing with. But I think the key bit here is by mapping these and looking at analysing the data, we've got a good sense of where we are now. I think that's the key point. And what were the good elements, and what can we do to move forward and take those and improve? It's it was not so much about the good and bad tactics. It was more about creating the stepping stone, about evidence-based practices. And by knowing what your portfolio is and your portfolio strategies, you can start to understand what you're trying to achieve. I think that's the key message I want to get here. And it might be around increased legitimacy. It might be about increasing confidence. But in my studies, it was about impact on reducing crime. Okay, this activity analysis study you might be interested in. It's, again, something that we don't do at the moment, and this wasn't particularly obvious. It wasn't a particular thing that the organisation was studying. But I asked the question, how much time do officers actually have available for patrol? Uniformed officers, okay? Bear in mind we've got about 2,000 cops. And there was about 1,100 or so officers took part in this. And what it was over a 2-week window where officers, I don't know if you do something similar to this in the States, or I mean we've stopped doing it now, but for every 15 minutes they would log an activity of what they were doing. Okay, so whether it was taking a witness statement, whether it was taking arresting a prisoner, whether it's transport, whether it was a refreshment break, whether it's interviewing a prisoner, all those things were logged for 15-minute intervals. So you did get a very accurate summary of what officers were doing for the full tour of their duty. Okay, so it's a persuasive argument to say, look, concentrating on those strategies which work will be seen as the most cost-effective. That goes without saying. But the activity analysis allowed me to actually identify the amount of times that officers would be able to spend on visible patrol. So I examined 3 areas. I looked at the reactive cops, okay? That was the rapid response officers, reacting to 999 emergency. I looked at our safer neighbourhood team officers, where we have them out in different, about 100 or so neighbourhoods across the force. They're only small teams, but they're in about 100 neighbourhoods. And then I looked at roads policing unit as well. Okay, and what was interesting was the final figure was, as you would imagine, reactive cops don't have a lot of time to spend on visible patrol. They only have 15% of their time. What was key to this was safer neighbourhood teams have 33% and roads policing unit have 20%, a fifth of their time available for spending on patrol. So if you, certainly on the safer neighbourhood teams, by telling them, this goes back to the quite simplistic thing that I said, how do you make a decision whether to turn right or left out the police station? You've got to be focusing them on the strategies that we know that work. So all the ones that I mapped, there were some safer neighbourhood team strategies in there that were effective. And there were other strategies in there that were effective as well. So we're going to continue to do those. So out of that time available to them, and one of the things I was going to mention about Chris Coper, which you'll hear in a lot more detail, but this was around thinking about more carefully about how targeting resources to a particular location. And if I can get officers to spend 15 minutes on patrol in a particular area for the purposes of deterring antisocial behaviour or hotspots, a crime hotspot, for the purposes of deterring crime, because that's the maximum deterrent effect if they spend that time in there, and I'm not stealing Chris's great work, that would be a huge step in the right direction. And I've started to try and do that. I did it when I've listened to your presentation back in Cambridge and tried to convince other operational cops that, look, stand in this location for 15 minutes, because actually not only people might speak to you, you can actually find out what's going on. You can have a maximum deterrent effect in a crime occurring, as Chris will explain later. And you might actually be able to do some sort of situational crime prevention when you're here. So it is a good tactic. And it's those sorts of things that might seem very basic to us, but actually it's something that we need to really push as leaders. So, in conclusion, what did I find? Okay, it was the first attempt to identify and quantify some of the strengths of the patrol functions, as it says there. It was the first use of the matrix, practically speaking, and I have to say, it's quite a daunting task for me to do this. If I hadn't had Cynthia there guiding me through step by step, I wouldn't be here. But I was really pleased with the result, and it really helped us focus on how our organisation is structured with regards to its own patrol portfolio. And that was the key point. I would urge you to think about this yourself, saying, look, we didn't know this in that much detail. We thought what we were doing was right, and a lot of strategy. We wouldn't have had 8 years of consecutive crime reduction had we not been doing something right. I think that's the key point that the chief would make. So this is just supporting some of that work. But I think the key area here is about the coding, and the time spent thinking about deployment is a really important factor. I think obviously I mentioned there the tendency of our patrol is about individuals, general and reactive. However, 9 of the strategies, 4 person-based and 5 place-based, were identified as promising, so 9 in total. So that's not a bad effort. We were able to identify some gaps and make recommendations. I think the key element here was, if I was the chief, going back to the point was made earlier, what changes would I make? And they would be quite simply what I put there. I would use the research evidence and the results of this study to increase the strategic knowledge of our staff, and I've started doing that already, as I've already mentioned, about how the use of evidence-based policing can assist in evidence-based practice and the research and the matrix, and provide operation managers with another tool, because this is a translation tool, a research to practice translation tool, which Cynthia's mentioned. It is actually, when you actually cut right down to the basic, right down to the weeds, dead easy to use. You know, it really is. You know, if your mechanism of prevention is around crime reduction, use the matrix, because what the operational superintendent, my colleague, is doing back in Derbyshire, he's got into his analyst department and said, look, why aren't you using this? And they've said, oh, because, you know, some of it's like the kids are going to break up at half term and there's going to be an increase in antisocial behaviour. Well, so what, if that's their prediction? The bottom line with this is you click into the matrix and see some other studies, and he's picked stuff up on there already about other studies, and he said, well, actually, alcohol-related harm, which is a big issue in England, and violent crime linked to alcohol-related harm, there's a load of studies in there to say you should be trying X, Y, and Z. And he's picked things up already. So it is useful for your researchers and analysts to actually just click in there and see what other types of work's gone out there. It doesn't matter that the work was done in the States or it was done in England. It's a really useful thing. So the bottom line for my final statement on this: by understanding your own agency's portfolio, you can be more thoughtful about your deployment and therefore be more cost effective. With potentially less resources available, you know, forces have really got to focus their patrol on what works. And that's why I would recommend the evidence-based policing matrix to you today. Thank you.